Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, an hour-long discussion of the war that the U.S. government is waging around the world. It's a real war. Our president and government are killing people. They're pretending that they're doing it to protect us. But instead, they're committing murder for the profits and the worldwide economic control of a tiny minority, an economic elite we've come to call the 1%. The killing is very much against the interests of the majority of Americans and people around the world. We want to discuss that tonight, a discussion that, strangely enough, you rarely hear on radio or television these days. I'm Carl Estabrook. It's February 11th. Our program is presented by members and friends of AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. Tonight we'll hear comments from Ron Szoke, underthink and overstretch, Karen Aram on the pivot to Asia, David Johnson and Karen Evans-Levy on comments on the conjunction, and Ron Kester on U.S. government drug dealing. If there's time, a video on the NSA and Obama's assassinations. AWARE was formed by local citizens after the attacks of 9/11-2001, when it was clear that the U.S. government would use those crimes as an excuse to carry on and expand its decades-long wars for the control of Middle East energy resources. Control, and not just access, to those Mideast oil and gas supplies has been the cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy since the Second World War, when the U.S. State Department described them as, quote, the world's greatest material prize. Contrary to what we're told, we in fact import very little of our energy, the energy we use at home, from the Mideast, and the amount is declining too. Most of our imported oil comes from the Western Hemisphere, notably Canada and Venezuela. But control of worldwide energy flows gives the U.S. government an unparalleled advantage over our economic rivals in Europe and Asia. In other words, President Obama is killing men, women, and children around the world in our name because China needs oil, and the U.S. government is determined to control where they get it. The president is working for the 1% who profit from arms and oil, not for the vast majority of us. We don't want these murderous wars. 3 out of 4 Americans oppose them, and we don't want to pay for them, but we are. The American people are the problem for Obama. They recently stopped him from bombing Syria. Americans don't want more war and are suffering from the administration's economic policies. But politicians, bankers, and corporations do want war, so it's clear whom Obama is working for. To mislead the U.S. populace, the president says that he's conducting these vastly expensive wars to stop terrorism and protect civilians. But we can see that instead he's killing civilians and creating terrorists. What we've done is terrible. Over the last 50 years, American presidents have killed, wounded, and made homeless well over 20 million human beings, mostly civilians. That's why the late Martin Luther King called the U.S. government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. It's still true. President Obama campaigned against that awful record, hope and change, he said, but he was misleading people in order to get elected. Being political, Defense Secretary Robert Gates recently called it. Immediately Obama got into office, he expanded the U.S. Mideast wars. Americans find it hard to admit that he was simply lying to us, that he was going to kill people for the 1%, not end the U.S. wars, but that was indeed the case. Within the first 5 months of Obama's presidency in 2009, he not only sent tens of thousands more U.S. troops to Afghanistan, he also authorized a massive expansion of clandestine military and intelligence operations worldwide. He ordered so-called special forces to be sent into both friendly and hostile nations in the Middle East, Central Asia, and Africa. The deployment of heavily equipped American killers and kidnappers into dozens of new countries was designed, in General Petraeus' words, to, quote, penetrate, disrupt, defeat, or destroy enemies of the U.S. government beyond the rule of law with no trials or pretenses of accountability. they were also to, quote, prepare the environment for larger attacks from the U.S. and NATO. The Obama administration was not just responding to terrorism. Today, the U.S. Special Operations Command, SOCOM, American Death Squads, consist of more than 70,000 U.S. troops, active in more than 100 countries around the world, according to their own spokesman. These troops are accountable not to Congress, but only to the President's National Security Council. They're a private army, killing people around the world in what is nothing less than the world's greatest terrorist campaign, run out of the White House. No wonder the U.S. is hated around the world. President Obama has assassinated 4,000 people, including American citizens and 200 children, with drone strikes alone. He said of himself, "It turns out I'm really good at killing people. I didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine," close quote. And he's arranged to imprison Americans indefinitely without charge or trial, all in violation of the Constitution he was sworn to uphold. Because of President Obama's intense propaganda and the shameful cooperation of the American media, most Americans don't know the extent of the war that the U.S. has brought to the rest of the world. At our recent anti-war demonstrations in Champaign and Urbana, the most frequently asked questions were, "What war?" And by those a bit better informed, "Which war?" Here we try to explain that. You're watching Aware on the Air, where we try to help to frustrate the 1%'s war policy as it's put into practice by the present administration. And we'll begin tonight with Ron Szoke, Underthink and Overstretch.
Yes. I'm alluding to the ever greater commitments of the USA to defend other countries around the world in part. This is provoked to some extent by a book that I've been finding interesting, going back to the late 90s actually. Paul Kennedy's book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. It's about empires, their rise and fall, and the possible parallels to what we've been doing over the last decade or two around the world, especially in the Middle East, but now apparently we're pivoting to Asia. Maybe David will say more about that. So why do empires arise and fall? Part of the diagnosis by Professor Kennedy of Yale is what he calls imperial overstretch, taking on ever greater aspirations to control more and more countries and people. And this has reached kind of the ultimate limit. In the United States today, it seems that our aspiration, although this will never be admitted explicitly, is to rule the world and not allow any country or agency or organization anywhere to challenge us militarily, economically, and we are out to prevent that. And the country is now, the USA is drowning in armaments, ever greater supplies of weapons, tanks, planes, ships, aircraft carriers, and I'll come back to that. So headline, U.S. vows to defend Japan against China. This sounds like a very dubious proposition to me, but we'll let you decide whether this is overstretch in one direction. And the longstanding vow to defend Israel no matter what in the other direction. Can we really sustain this? It turns out the Soviet Union couldn't sustain that kind of global stretch, and I suspect in the long run we can't either. Secretary of State John Kerry vowed Friday that the United States would defend Japan against attack, including over islands claimed by China, as tensions boil over between the Asian powers. That includes, with respect to the South China Sea, he said, before correcting himself, to say the East China Sea, where China and Japan have conflicting claims to a couple of small uninhabited islands there. The gimmick seems to be that there are possibly some mineral resources there or oil in that area, and that seems to be what the conflict is really about. Fears of conflict arose in November when China imposed an air defense identification zone over much of the East China Sea. Beijing says it now requires notification from planes crossing a group of islands administered by Tokyo, known in Japanese as the Sakakyu and the Chinese as Diaoyu. Quoting, the United States neither recognizes nor accepts China's declared East China Sea, and the United States has no intention of changing how we conduct operations in the region, Kerry said. So, of course, when these things are done by them, they are provocations. When we say or do them, why they're not, they're just routine. The American overstretch into the Middle East has been judged, and the resulting wars have been judged a failure by the majority of the American population. Headline, U.S. public wars in Iraq and Afghanistan failures. New poll finds bleak outlooks with Republican attitudes toward Iraq war significantly more grim than they used to be. It was considered a matter of loyalty and patriotism to endorse anything done by the American military. And I think this has palled a bit. People are becoming disillusioned with that. Even the Republicans now, who were the most feverish in their endorsements of the war, are apparently, according to the polls, having more and more doubts. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, headline, top Israel lobby group, AIPAC, loses its battle on Iran, but the war is not over. Curious one that occurred, that showed up this morning, I believe. Israel versus the pro-Israel lobby. The state of Israel, meaning the Likud regime, essentially, has told AIPAC, or what's the main component of the Israel lobby in Washington, D.C., to cool it and to stop pressing the increase of the sanctions on Iraq, which are very likely to lead to a war that we, in my judgment and most people's judgment, don't want and don't need in the Middle East. But
you mean sanctions on
here we go.
Iran?
Ordinarily, when Washington's most powerful pro-Israel lobby asks senators to do something, lawmakers of both parties are happy to oblige. Not just some of them, but all of them. Ordinarily, routinely, the Israel lobby, and again, AIPAC in particular, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, gets 100% vote on everything that it proposes. On crucial Capitol Hill votes, this says, measures by favored by AIPAC often passed unopposed. Last week was different, very, very different. First, AIPAC was forced in the wake of Democratic opposition to retreat for the moment on the Iran sanctions, but the bill had been the bill that they've been pushing for months. Then nearly every Republican in the Senate ignored AIPAC's call for a retreat on the bill and decided to keep on pushing on it anyway. So a lot of people are being apparently afraid of being called an anti-Semite if they don't immediately vote in favor of everything that the Israel lobby wants from them. So this then reminds me of something I think I mentioned last week. Headline, potent pro-Israel group finds its momentum blunted. So they have not been able to put this one over so far, but it's merely been put off. It's postponed, and we'll be hearing a lot more about it again. Meanwhile, Israel has given final approval to new East Jerusalem apartments, contrary to international law and American requests. A city committee on Wednesday gave final approval for more than 500 new apartments in Jewish neighborhoods of East Jerusalem, a routine bureaucratic step that nonetheless could cause ripples in Washington's efforts to broker a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. And in fact, it's likely to kill it. The neighborhoods in territory Israel captured during the 1967 war and later annexed are considered illegal settlements by most of the world. The chief Palestinian negotiator insisted that such moves undermine the peace process, and on Wednesday was quoted in the Times of Israel, a website, as saying the international community must hold Israel accountable for this policy. So, meanwhile, we continue arming in this country, building ever more tanks, airplanes, ships. There was another aircraft carrier, supposed to be a marvel of up-to-date technology, launched in November, the Gerald Ford. Navy christens the next generation of aircraft carriers, Norfolk, Virginia. The most technologically advanced aircraft carrier the United States has built was launched then, called a technological marvel by the Chief of Naval Operations. Another commentator, James Quack, has written online, Why We Have a Debt Problem, Part 23. We have 11 aircraft carrier groups. No other country in the world has more than one. Everyone who has looked at the issue has agreed that we could do with fewer than 11 while still achieving our national security goals. Bush-Obama Defense Secretary Robert Gates, Obama Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel, and think tanks on both the left and the right have said this. But apparently we can't retire even one, even though we would save not just the annual operating costs, but most of the $4.7 billion it will cost to refurbish over the next 5 years. Instead, the Obama administration has promised the Pentagon that it can simply have more money and not comply with the spending limits set on the 2011 debt ceiling agreement as modified by Murray Ryan. So legislators from states with Navy bases don't want to reduce the Navy's budget. More important, though, Mr. Quack says, few people want to be for a smaller military, even when our military is irrationally large, given our national priorities. The obvious underlying problem is that every line item in the budget has an interest group that wants it in there. The slightly less obvious underlying problem is that every budgetary debate is fought on its own without regard to the trade-offs that it entails. So the military needs more and more money for things that even they, in many cases, such as the tanks, have repudiated. They've said, we don't want them, we don't need them, but they keep getting them anyway, because any attempt to reduce production will immediately be met with the outcry that we'll lose jobs. So what has happened to the American military? That's a continuing theme with me. I'll just read a couple more headlines and stop. In the National Guard, hundreds suspected in recruiting fraud scheme. This was in the local daily on February 5th. Program to boost Guard enlistment was scammed out of $29 million, investigators say. The continuing accelerating crisis over sexual attacks in the military. There are 3 or 4 female Democratic senators who have made an issue of this, are trying to get Congress to pass an improved military justice bill that will take the investigation of sexual attacks and assaults and rapes out of the chain of command, so that people don't have to be so afraid about reporting them. It will, of course, if you're a woman in the military, get you very quickly branded as a troublemaker if you report any of this happening. And of course, if you thought you might want a career there, that will end any possible career. Senators Jean Shaheen, Democrat of North Dakota; Gillibrand, Democrat of New York; Barbara Boxer, Democrat of California; Heidi Heitkamp, I'm sorry, that's the Democrat of North Dakota. Jeannie Shaheen is Democrat of New Hampshire. So there we are. It's not looking good, and the deterioration and decline of the military is a theme that I'll be coming back to, no doubt. So that's enough.
Thank you, Ron. You're watching Aware on the Air. Members and friends of Aware on the panel here perhaps have comments about the stories brought to us by the Mad Hat Man here. Yes.
I think on the issue regarding what Ron just mentioned, I forget the name of the bill that they're sponsoring, that the ladies are sponsoring against having to, when raped, having to go to their superior officers.
Right.
That I think I posted and circulated a petition just yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, because they claim that Kristen Gildenbrand is weakening a bit on that. So it's something we have to keep pushing. That's what I read yesterday. I want to make a comment on the pivot to Asia. Last Friday on News Neptune, I discussed an article that I had just briefly read. John Pfeffer of the Institute of Policy Studies, who also writes for the Tom Dispatch, had been talking about how the pivot to Asia was actually a retreat, which I found very shocking, but I hadn't read it in depth. I was running out the door literally. I read it over, and he still focuses on the fact that it's all about containment, which is what we have been seeing and viewing. The difference is he's making his point that we are using others, we are using our allies to enforce this containment. It's not like we're out there to threaten China or to put ourselves in harm's way, because we have so much interest right now in China, our corporations do. So it's about the Philippines, it's about Vietnam, it's about South Korea. They are in fear right now of China because of the U.S. propagandizing. And as a result, they're all building up their militaries. And of course, Abe in Japan, you know, Japan had been demilitarized ever since World War II, and now they're building up their military. And of course, and China has half the military that the U.S. has, or something along those lines. And then he was talking about how in order to, we're selling all of these military weapons and arsenals to all of these people, and pity our poor allies because we're enforcing them to purchase our F-35s, which are known to have at least 789 problems, and I forget the amount of money that they would cost. But this is the kind of business that we're doing. So when you talk about this stretch, yeah. Absolutely. And the pivot to Asia, the pivot to China, of course, it's all about containment of China, absolutely. But we're using other nations, and they're really, I think they're really in fear. I see this also in Thailand, is that people who have always been very open and generous to the Chinese were always welcome in Thailand. They've intermarried so much you can't find a Thai that doesn't have Chinese relatives. But when my daughter was there recently, she noticed people were making negative comments about the Chinese, meaning China, even though many of them have relatives and ancestors there. So she felt very strongly that Thailand was getting a lot of the propaganda that we've seen here in the U.S. And I know, of course, it's coming from the U.S. because Thailand has long been our little satellite colony in Southeast Asia. So I just wanted to make that point.
I think there's a problem here that we need vocabulary. We need to be able to talk about American policy without being having our minds colonized by the way it's been discussed, not just since the Cold War, not just since World War II, but indeed for a century. I mean, the two principal words in this discussion, beginning with Paul Kennedy and then with George Kennan, actually, whose name came up in our discussions beforehand today. The two principal words are empires defending their clients, and the question of whether the U.S. has taken on the defense of too many nations. Once you pose the question that way, you've begged the question in the traditional meaning of the word, in that you've answered it. You say, we're defending those people. We're not defending them at all. We're colonizing them economically, if not directly militarily. Second word is containment. We're containing China. And the classic statement of this was the work by George Kennan about the Soviet Union after the Second World War. And American policy at the end of the Second World War was precisely to control its erstwhile ally, the Soviet Union, which of course had won the war. We have this American mythology that the U.S. somehow won the Second World War in Europe. No, the Second World War in Europe was won by the Soviet Union, by Russia. And therefore the problem for the U.S. was how to contain the Soviet Union. That is, to prevent the Soviet Union from exercising what it had won in the war. Now, the notions of defense and containment as descriptions of American policy are propagandistic. That's not what we're doing. That's not what we're doing at all. We're organizing the world for the benefit of the American elite. George Kennan wrote in 1949 that the U.S., with 5% of the world's population, had 50% of the world's wealth, and that the task in the coming age, says Kennan, will be to maintain the disparity. We're going to have to cease dealing with idealistic concepts of democracy and human rights, he said, and deal in straight power concepts. This was a top secret document, of course, but Kennan expressed the view of the American foreign policy establishment, the American government in general, in terms of what it was going to do in the coming years. You can read off everything from Vietnam to Kosovo to the Ukraine last week in terms of the notions of what the U.S. was doing. And it's a mistake, I think, for us to talk about the idea that we're defending someone other than the profits of the 1%, and that we're containing anyone other than those who might want to compete with the sorts of economic and indeed military and political control that the U.S. has exercised. An acceptable rant, gentlemen, ladies?
Somewhat, yes.
I really like, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I really agree with that, that we shouldn't talk about defense and that we shouldn't talk about, it seems more like we are expanding and we are, even our friends, we would like to contain them if they started getting too large too. So I agree that the terminology, we need to look at where we're accepting the propaganda from our country. Go ahead. David had something, but Stuart, you had something right now.
Well, I just wanted to follow on your comment about how funding is discussed in Congress, where one supports military funding because that's the thing to do, and a strikingly scarce contrast to that came a couple of weeks ago when Bernie Sanders proposed to restore cuts in funding to veterans benefits by taking them directly from overseas contingency operations, which means war fighting. And he was roundly condemned for that in the Senate for having upset the apple cart. But at least he was raising it in a way that hadn't been raised before. And as Bob Naiman of Just Foreign Policy points out, by proposing that sort of transfer, he's sort of forcing Congress to admit that taking care of veterans is an actual part of the cost of making war.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, anytime there's a war, you have expenses, even after it's officially over, and we don't seem to be able to definitively terminate them anymore, at least for another 50 years, looking after the veterans, the injured people coming from the war. So it's a long-term commitment, but our leaders don't seem to understand that, or if they do, they're blowing it off.
Well, doesn't this also meet up with what we, Victoria Nuland conversation
Right.
related to Russia, what our policies are in relation to Russia and the Ukraine? So if we don't use the
and
word...
Europeans.
Right.
We know what we want to do with them, right?
Yeah,
So
right.
if we don't use the word containment, what we're really trying to do is to diminish the power of other nations that we see as being powerful. And we know that Russia and China, and one of the things China has always known is that they have a contract with their people, and that is to keep them fed and keep them, give them options and opportunities. And if they're spending money on military, they're not feeding their people. And then they are jeopardized. Well, the same thing goes for these Southeast Asian nations that are buying our expensive military weapons out of fear, is that all money that goes towards military means that you're taking it away from supporting your people. And our government knows that as well. But so I see this as an issue. This is how you diminish the power of a nation, of a government, is by forcing them into militarizing.
David, you got a comment on this?
Yes, I think terminology is very important here because, I try not to use the word defense,
Yeah.
defense budget,
Exactly.
defense contractors. Let's call these people what they are, war profiteers.
Here we are.
Yes.
That term used to be used a lot in the 1930s, to describe war profiteers, or what people want to call defense industry. And there's a common propaganda around that unfortunately a lot of people buy into, is that war is good for the economy. Well, for some in the economy, the 1%. But see, that's the whole thing is that it's us, the American people, the taxpayers, that have to pay for these wars. And why are these wars being fought all over the, now moving into Asia? It's not to defend the American people. I mean, come on. Who's going to invade the United States? Seriously. I mean, the only one that can invade the United States is the United States. I mean, there's no other country in the world that has a military capability to invade the United States. I mean, this is all a lie. The whole purpose of this is empire, to wage wars of empire for the purpose of corporate control and profits for the 1%. That is the bottom line. And unfortunately, it's us, the American people, and the working people of the world that have to pay for this through taxes, have to pay for this for the losing benefits, like in the United States, wanting to cut Social Security, trying to prevent a Medicare for all health care system, no investments in solar, or very few in solar, wind, and high-speed rail, or just general infrastructure that's falling apart everywhere. If you go almost anywhere in the United States, you can see it. Compared to Europe, I mean, this is almost like a third world country, or it's becoming a third world country, I should say. Likewise with our living standards. So I mean, we need to keep all this in mind, is that they're not doing this for us. They're not doing this to protect us. This is all about profits for the global elite. And I think Ron's point about, I mean, with these aircraft carriers and stuff, I mean, this is obscene, this level. And now moving into Asia, and it's really interesting that, Karen's point is really good. And what I think of was when here just a year or two ago, when Greece was having all this austerity imposed on it by the IMF and World Bank. What was it they wanted them to spend their money on? They wanted them to cut pensions and other things to help people, the average person in Greece, and instead they want to buy German fighter planes. I mean, this is revealing. It's very similar to what you're saying now. I mean, and it's just it's a sick system that's frankly it's not just dangerous, but I mean it's just it's a waste. It's a total waste, and not to mention the fact that as American citizens, working people in particular, not only do we have to pay for this through taxes and lost benefits, we also have to, it's our sons and daughters, particular sons, that go and fight these wars to enrich this 1%. I mean, and then they come back, as was pointed out by Bernie Sanders, to where they're traumatized, either mentally or physically, and then they have to be taken care of. And now they want to cut benefits to these people that they had go there and fight for them. I mean, this is just, it's obscene.
And yet we have this constant drumbeat from the administration that it's a dangerous world out there for Americans. Terrorists may get us, and obviously we have to do something about that. Terrorism has to be fought. Obviously we want to fight it in the most efficient way, like finding where terrorists are using metadata and the NSA and sending drones to drop bombs on them. I mean, it's a fantasy world, but it's the fantasy that is American propaganda, and that most Americans, constantly assailed by this propaganda, know, well, look, Obama has, he seems to be trying to shift the burden of fighting the war from troops on the ground to drones. The drones will go get the bad guys. We don't have to send our troops after them. This is a conscious strategy, a propaganda strategy, a conscious strategy by the administration to, in fact, extend its war, which, as we say, is being fought for these wholly different reasons. But that's not even part of the discussion. That seems to me, that's why we got to do programs like this. You're watching Aware on the Air, where the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana tries to talk about what's not being said by our administration.
I just wanted to bring up one more point, and that's regarding the Senkaku Islands that China is in dispute with Japan over. If you look at a map, you'll see that these little oil-rich islands, well, how oil-rich they are, it's debatable, but they're located off the tip of Taiwan, which was at one time part of China. I assume that Japan, which is further away, probably gained them when they were occupying Taiwan.
Karen, I had a question.
Yeah.
You know, as everyone knows, in the last, since the early, actually mid-90s, the combination of the WTO treaty and the China trade preference treaty, where now you can't, everything we buy in the stores is made in China. So a lot of the U.S. corporations have gotten very wealthy from this.
Right.
The cheap labor
Right.
and everything else. So what's changed here? I mean, I would think this would be a mighty fine line to walk in the consideration that corporations and banks in particular control our government. And they've gotten very rich off of China, so has something changed to where?
Yes.
And what is that?
Well, for one thing, a lot of the cheaper products, okay, that we once were bringing in from China, we have now taken to other nations, lower cost. They lack any kind of environmental rules, laws, regulations, such as Vietnam, such as
Burma.
Bangladesh.
Well, Burma's on the rise. Yeah,
Yes.
we still have sanctions against doing business in Burma. Okay,
we do.
there was a whole other story. Yeah, but definitely Bangladesh. So the cheap labor is not the necessary goal. In fact, what we're doing now is a lot of electronics. As I pointed out regarding, I think last week on Aware, China is in the process of building the new Silk Road. And they are going to be a lot of it. They've already built some of it. They've already got rail lines. We're talking about high-speed rail that cuts the time, I think, less than half the time as previous to get from one city to another. Well, they already have it built all the way to Germany. They use German and, German and one other nationality. Japanese technology, but then they improved upon it themselves, and now they're building it through a lot of Southeast Asia, through Europe, and they're going to be going all the way to Istanbul. This is, and hopefully, and through Burma, it's an issue in Thailand, Laos, Malaysia, all the way to Singapore. So they're going to be able to go and distribute their products to all of the various different ports, as well as bringing in products. Remember, China's the biggest market of the future. As they increase their spending, the average worker, they will be buying our products. That is what we look for when we go in to do manufacturing. We also look for a market for the future to sell our products. Well, you have, I don't know all the names of these technical, it's computer, it's electronics that are being produced in China, primarily in Kunming, and they're distributing them to Germany, and the goal of U.S. manufacturers is to be able to further distribute them all over the world, literally. So the U.S. profits from that. So as China has developed, they are becoming obviously a greater threat to us.
Economically.
Economically, absolutely. And that's what we're looking at. But like I said, U.S. corporations are embedded there. I don't see these U.S. corporations looking necessarily, maybe Vietnam, but I don't see them looking at Bangladesh. I don't see them even leaving China unless they find that it's not as satisfactory.
Now, the Obama administration has worked as strenuously as it could to keep Americans in ignorance of what its real military policy was, of what it was doing even. The drone program is secret, remember, and much more importantly, why it was doing it. It's done the same thing with its economic policy. The centerpiece of the Obama economic policy is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And the Obama administration is deathly afraid that the principal opponent of the Trans-Pacific Partnership will find out about it. It too is secret. That principal opponent, of course, is the American people. They don't want to talk about it, and they want to be sure that Congress passes it without discussion. It has what's called fast-track authority for votes on trade deals, which means that the deal, when it's finally revealed to Congress by the Obama administration, cannot be amended or changed in any way. It can only be approved or rejected. Now, they're in trouble on this. The Obama administration has as much trouble in its economic policy as it is in its military policy, and the opposition is coming from the same place, that is the American people. Therefore, its principal weapon is obfuscating what they're doing so that people don't know about what the real economic arrangements with China are, or even with Bangladesh. Much more importantly, what the economic control of the Pacific that would result from the Trans-Pacific Partnership should be. The task, once again, is to break through the administration's propaganda and to try to tell Americans what our government is doing, ostensibly in our name and against our interests. It leaves us in an astonishing position that in some ways is as strikingly offset as it's been any time in living memory. There's a greater division between what the American government is doing and what it's telling its people it's doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's also very telling that when China wanted to sign on to the Trans-Pacific Partnership,
Right.
the U.S. is no.
Yeah.
They don't want China signing on to
Well,
it.
because-
Everybody else, but not China. That's so telling.
It's a dispute with China over control of the Pacific
Right.
economy. I
Right.
mean, look, in many ways, the Vietnam War was a dispute over control of the Pacific economy. The U.S. was much concerned about killing people in Vietnam and sending half the American military there because it was afraid that if Vietnam should be able to develop independently, as the Vietnamese wanted, Japan and other important Asian economies would be attracted into that arrangement. And we can't have that, said the Americans. We have to control the economic development of Japan. We have to control the economic development of Asia. And we can't have independent operations on our block. It's the mafia principle. The Godfather is perfectly happy to license people who are working in his area, but you're not going to run an independent operation in his area. And that was what the Vietnamese threatened to do.
Great analogy, Carl.
Yeah, yeah, really.
Gangster diplomacy.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's exactly that.
It is exactly.
And once again, I mean, this is Chomsky's remark about why we don't study history. He says we don't study history because it teaches us too much. This contest with China goes back even before some of us were born. I mean, it goes back indeed to the end of the 19th century at least.
Sure.
I've got to tell a personal story here because I want to. My maternal grandfather graduated from the Naval Academy in 1907. In other words, 7 years before the outbreak of the First World War. And as an American naval officer, he was sent to China. And the whole point of sending these American naval officers to China was to preside over the economic opening of China for the benefit of American corporations. This is 1907.
Right. Yeah.
The policy, which had been established a generation earlier, was called the open door in China. What the open door in China meant was that all countries, corporations from all countries, could go to China and make money there. That's what the U.S. was insisting upon. That's what the open door meant. And the real objection, of course, with that unpleasantness with Japan in the 1940s was the Japanese tried to close that door. The greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, as the Japanese called their plan for the Pacific, was directed precisely against the American policy of 2 generations earlier of the open door. No, said the Japanese, we're going to close the door to the Americans and Europeans and develop our own economy for ourselves. Just exactly say what the Americans had said to the British in the 18th century. But, you know, we weren't having that. And we insisted that, you know, Japanese weren't to do that, and the subsequent events had to do a great deal with our making our economic run throughout the region, whatever the people of the region thought. None of this is new.
No. I have a tidbit to add on that. When we were there, along with other European nations, the Dutch, the British, and the Japanese, we were an entity. Each nation had their own community.
Yep.
And their own form of embassy, and they were a law unto themselves, meaning no one came under Chinese law. I mean, can you imagine such arrogance? That meant if anything happened within a particular community, that nation took care of it. But the Chinese had absolutely no say whatsoever, which is one of the reasons why when eventually China was able to develop and after what they went through from the Japanese, they became very strongly, what is the word I want to use, ethnocentric briefly. I won't label them.
Xenophobic? Yeah.
Somewhat xenophobic because they had put up with this arrogance, is the only way I can describe it, of the European nations and some Asian as well.
And doesn't this go farther back even than what you described, Carl, back to the 1830s with the British importing opium from India into China?
Oh, yeah.
Started
yeah,
opium
yeah,
wars.
yes.
That purpose was to get a foothold
Right.
into China for economics, which leads into a whole new another topic.
Right.
Opium wars have continued to this day, frankly.
To this day, absolutely.
Yeah.
And as someone said, imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, right? So.
And I'm just going to bring it back home, too. In order to continue all the things that we do abroad, we also rely on keeping people here uneducated and not critical thinkers and also poor. And so bringing it all back, that's the way that we're going to keep a perpetual war going for the 1%.
Yeah, that's part of what I meant by underthink. As for overstretch, can the USA really run the world? I mean, running the world requires real discipline, I think, that we don't seem to have. And I don't think that we can rule the world for very long, although there's this apparently myth circulating that we can somehow impose a 1,000-year Reich on the rest of the world, and I don't think it can work.
But isn't the
Look at all
history...
we've done for Iraq.
Yeah?
Look at all we've done for Iraq.
Well,
Yeah,
exactly.
right.
Perfect example, yes.
Aren't they grateful? Yes, went from one of the highest standard of living in the Arab world to a third world country status, probably on the level of almost Somalia in some ways. But what's interesting is having a history of empires. Empires seem always overextend themselves eventually, and always eventually collapse.
Yeah, there's a great tendency, I think, you know, to try to find patterns in history when these things occur. In other words, if we attend to history at all, we attend to it in too sweeping a fashion. The immense prestige of Arnold Toynbee's study of history followed on the Second World War while the U.S. was constructing a mythology about how it was establishing, as Ron said, its own 1,000-year Reich. It seems to me that the examination of the history itself has to be vetted for political concerns. We have to be very careful of that. I think we're coming up to an interesting debate on that and on another topic that we've mentioned here in passing, and that's the question of inequality both in the U.S. and in the world at large. A new book published by a Frenchman, Thomas Piketty, has suggested that the real imperial structure of modern society is the structure of capitalism, which, Piketty argues, naturally produces the vast inequalities. It does not lead to idealized Adam Smith world where all things work together for the good, but rather just the opposite. It leads to what we've seen in this country in the last 2 generations, the increasing concentration, indeed the accelerating concentration of wealth into fewer and fewer hands, until finally there's some sort of catastrophic redistribution. We can look on the Depression and the Second World War as being that sort of catastrophic redistribution. And Piketty argues that there's an accelerating effect to this, this pattern, and that we may be coming up on something like that again, perhaps so. Much larger, indeed, than the last one.
Yeah, well, it seems plausible to me that capitalism in its purer forms is inherently unstable. You see it in business cycles, and you see in the increasing dialectic of the rich and the poor around the world. So I very much doubt that the invisible hand that Adam Smith talked about is going to be operative. Instead, we're giving the vast majority of the people around the world the invisible finger, it seems.
Which actually is far closer to what the author of The Wealth of Nations really said in the first place. So we're dealing with ideology here. To come back to the immediate political question and the question of what this administration is doing, it seems to me that it has to be interrogated in these terms. We have to look at what previous administrations have done, what the sweep of American history has done economically and militarily, and realize that the present administration is very much in that pattern, and that we need to be clear about what it's doing and why, in order to decide whether that's what we want it to do. Do we really want the occupant of the White House to be sending drones that have killed now some 200 Pakistani children? Most Americans say no, and therefore the government has to hide what it's doing from us. We've got to find out what it's doing and suggest that perhaps there are other ways of doing things.
So we
I thought Carl would comment on this thing that appeared in the media last week. Obama, you can't just murder an American overseas. How did this get into the media? They were supposedly deliberating in the White House about whether they kill this guy with a drone. And I don't doubt that they're doing that, but how did it get into the newspapers that this debate was going on within the White House or the Pentagon or wherever it was happening?
I think it was planted.
This is
a
from
way of disarming the stronger debate that Greenwald and Scale have brought up. They're saying, well, you know, we're thinking very hard about this. Our actions are well justified, and we have considered them carefully.
Yeah.
Which would be, they're trying to preempt that disclosure.
And we're vetting it with the legal guys. And,
right. And forget the Constitution. Let's just talk about.
Yeah.
Exactly. And shocking as it is, it seems to me there's just a hint of good news here. The fact that the ACLU is saying this publicly, is publicly calling the administration on it, and that the administration finds itself in a position where the legal basis, such as it is, upon which it's killing people around the world, the authorization for the use of military force from 2001, is now under some serious question. The administration knows that it is in trouble in maintaining the popular support for its killing around the world, and that's got to be a good sign.
Right. Yeah.
Concluding comments, ladies and gentlemen? You've been watching Aware on the Air, brought to you by members and friends of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group in the 7th week of 2014. Thanks to our director and producer, Jason Liggett. We also want to remind you of other programs like ours here on UPTV, now streaming online at urbanapublictelevision.org. Weekdays, Monday to Friday at 7 a.m., Democracy Now!, and thankfully it's repeated at 5 p.m. in the evening now, too. At 8 a.m., The Big Picture with Tom Hartman. And if you object to the Obama administration's conducting illegal and unjustified war and lying about the reasons for it, join us. Aware meets every Sunday evening, 5 to 6 p.m. in the White Horse Inn on John Street in Champaign, near the UIUC campus. We discuss the war and plan activities to frustrate the war makers.
On Saturday the 15th, we're going to try to have a table at Lincoln Square also.
Yes.
Yeah.
Come by and say hi, information about the war and various and sundry other paraphernalia.
Peace calendars. We still have peace calendars too, if anybody wants one. Sorry,
Finally,
No, that's all right. I think we've had a lot of people very interested in them, yeah.
yeah, they're very cool. Go ahead.
AWARE honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about and Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Ron Szoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Johnson, and other members and friends of AWARE, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.